ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਮੇਰਾ ਨਾਮ ਮਨਜਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਮਨਜੀਤ ਕੌਰ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਜੋ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਤੇ ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ।
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਮਨਜਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਡਾਕਟਰ, ਇਹ ਜੋ ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ, ਇਹ ਕੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ?
ਤੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਕੋਈ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਮੈਂਟਲੀ ਫਿਜ਼ੀਕਲੀ ਟੌਰਚਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਖਮੀ ਕਰਨਾ ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਸਜ਼ਾ ਦੇਣੀ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ। ਰਾਈਟ, ਸਜ਼ਾ ਫਿਜ਼ੀਕਲ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ, ਮੈਂਟਲੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ, ਵਰਬਲੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ। ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਘਰੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ, ਗਾਲਾਂ ਦੇਣ ਦਾ, ਜਾਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨਾ ਬੱਚੇ ਨਾਲ, ਜਾਂ ਥੱਪੜ ਮਾਰਨਾ, ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਕੂਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੁਲਿੰਗ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਦੈਟ ਕੁਡ ਬੀ ਸਮ ਸੌਰਟ ਆਫ ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼। ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਉਦਾਸੀ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ। ਅਸੀਂ 21ਵੀਂ ਸਦੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੈਠੇ, ਸਾਡੇ ਖਿਆਲ ਔਰ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਸੁਸਾਇਟੀਆਂ ਇੰਨੀਆਂ ਡੇਂਜਰਸ ਹੋ ਗਈਆਂ ਕਿ ਸਾਡੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਵਿਹੜਿਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਮ ਅਸੀਂ ਖੇਡਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਬੇਟਾ, ਐਂਡ ਵੀ ਵਰ ਸੇਫ। ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੱਚਾ, ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਰੋਡ 2-4 ਘਰ ਦੂਰ ਜਾਏਗਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਖਿੜਕੀ ਤੋਂ ਦੇਖੋਗੇ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਸੇਫਲੀ ਉਹ ਘਰ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ। ਸੋਸਾਇਟੀ ਇੱਕ ਇੰਨੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਆ, ਇੱਕ ਇੰਨੀ ਅਪਹੀਵਲ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਆ ਦੈਟ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਨਾਟ ਸੇਫ। ਮੈਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਿੰਡਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੇਖਦੀ ਬੱਚੇ ਭੱਜੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ, ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਦੂਸਰੇ 'ਚ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ। ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਹਾਈ ਨਿੱਕਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਆਪੇ ਹੀ ਸਕੂਲ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਛੱਡਣ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾਓਗੇ? ਅਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਕਦੀ ਵੀ ਨਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ 'ਚ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਭੇਜੀਏ। ਨਹੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹਨੇ ਆਪੇ ਟਿਊਸ਼ਨ ਕਰਕੇ ਆ ਜਾਣਾ। ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪੇ ਜਾਓ। ਨਹੀਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਕਾਫੀ ਫਿਕਰ ਕਰਦੀ ਆ। ਯੂ ਨੋ ਇਟ ਇਜ਼ ਸੇਫਰ ਪਿੰਡਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ।
ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਸਮੀ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਬਣਾਉਣਾ, ਚਾਈਲਡ ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼। ਤੇ ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਤੇ ਅਤਿਆਚਾਰ ਕਰਨੇ।
ਕੁਡ ਬੀ ਐਨੀਥਿੰਗ, ਫਿਜ਼ੀਕਲ ਵੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ, ਮੈਂਟਲ ਟੌਰਚਰ ਵੀ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ, ਯੂ ਨੋ। ਐਂਡ
ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਪਿੰਡਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੰਨਾ ਖਤਰਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਪਰ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੈਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸੀਗਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਕਾਫੀ ਰੇਪ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ।
ਰੇਪ ਤਾਂ ਪੁੱਛੋ ਹੀ ਨਾ,
ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਰੇਪ
ਬਹੁਤ,
ਉਹ ਵੀ ਲੜਕੇ, ਮੇਲ ਚਿਲਡਰਨ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਲੜਕੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਅਤਿਆਚਾਰ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ।
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ, ਔਰ ਲੜਕੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਵੀ, ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿ ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਬਾਹਰੋਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਕਈ ਘਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਖੁਦ ਪੇਸ਼ੈਂਟਸ ਆਏ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਨੇ ਦਾਦੇ ਤਾਏ ਚਾਚੇ ਹੈਵ ਰੇਪਡ देयर ਓਨ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ। ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਯੂ ਨੋ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਧੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਰਿਸ਼ਤਾ ਇਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਭਰਾ ਦਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤਾਏ ਚਾਚੇ ਦਾ। ਉਹ ਸੰਬੰਧ ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਬੇਟੇ, ਪਿੰਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਿੰਡਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀਆਂ ਧੀਆਂ ਭੈਣਾਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ। ਉਹ ਸ਼ਰਮ ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਗਈ। ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇੱਕ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਨਾ ਸਪੋਰਟ, ਇੱਕ ਭੈਣ ਦਾ ਸਿਰਫ ਰੱਖੜੀ ਵੇਲੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਰੱਖੜੀ ਵੇਲੇ ਬੰਦ ਹੋ, ਦੈਟ ਇਜ਼ ਯੋਰ ਸਿਸਟਰ ਫॉर ਪ੍ਰੋਟੈਕਸ਼ਨ। ਇੱਕ ਔਰਤ ਇੱਕ ਪਿੰਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ, ਜਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਕੋਈ ਛੇੜਖਾਨੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ। ਰੇਪ ਤਾਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, ਜਦੋਂ ਖੇਤ ਵੱਡੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ 6-6 ਫੁੱਟ ਉੱਚੇ, ਯੂ ਨੋ, ਗੰਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ। ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਖੇਤ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚਿੱਟਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਣਕ ਦਾ, 6-6 ਫੁੱਟ ਉੱਚੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ। ਹੁਣ ਤਾਂ ਸ਼ਾਰਟ ਹਾਈਬ੍ਰਿਡ ਕਣਕ ਹੋ ਗਈ। ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਰੇਪ ਉਦੋਂ ਖੇਤਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ।
ਡਾਕਟਰ, ਮੇਰੇ ਖਿਆਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਤਾਂ ਸਦੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਪਰ ਹੁਣ ਲੋਕੀ ਖੁੱਲ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਬੋਲ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ। ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੇਪ ਜੋ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਅੱਗੇ ਤੱਕ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਮਗਰ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਲੋਕੀ ਸ਼ਰਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਦੇ ਇੰਨਾ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਕਰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ। ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਹ ਰੇਪ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਲੜਕਿਆਂ ਦੇ, ਛੋਟੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਮੇਲ ਲੜਕਿਆਂ ਦੇ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੋਈ ਹਾਲੇ ਤੱਕ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਖੁੱਲ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ। ਸੋ ਇਹ ਕਾਹਤੋਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ?
ਅਗੇਨ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਬੰਦਾ ਰੇਪਿਸਟ ਹੈ ਉਹਦਾ ਫਿਜ਼ੀਕਲ ਡਿਜ਼ਾਇਰ ਲਾਈਫ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਪੂਰਾ ਹੋਇਆ, ਜਾਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਪਰਵਿਸ਼ ਗਲਤ ਹੋਈ ਆ, ਜਾਂ ਉਹ ਖੁਦ ਹੀ ਮੈਂਟਲੀ ਡਿਸਟਰਬਡ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹਨੇ ਸਮਹਾਉ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ, ਯੂ ਨੋ, ਇੰਨੀ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਜਾਨ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਪੋਜੀਸ਼ਨ 'ਚ ਪਾਉਣਾ, ਇਟਸ ਵੈਰੀ ਵੈਰੀ ਸੌਰਟ ਆਫ ਅਨਸੇਫ ਐਂਡ ਸੋ ਇਨਹਿਊਮੇਨ, ਯੂ ਨੋ।
ਸੋ ਜੋ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਕਮੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ,
ਕੋਈ ਦਿਮਾਗੀ ਤੌਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਪਰੇਸ਼ਾਨੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਡਰਾਈਵ, ਸੈਕਸ ਡਰਾਈਵ ਪੂਰਾ ਕਰਨਾ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੇ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਘਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਪੂਰਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਵਾਕਈ ਪਨਿਸ਼ ਕਰਨਾ ਜਾਂ ਕੰਟਰੋਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ। ਕਈਆਂ ਦਾ ਲੋ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਕਈਆਂ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਹਾਈ ਹੁੰਦਾ। ਬਟ ਜਿਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਐਬਨੋਰਮਲ ਹੈ, ਦਿਸ ਇਜ਼ ਐਬਨੋਰਮਲ ਥਿੰਗ ਟੂ ਡੂ ਟੂ ਐਨੀ ਸਮਬਡੀ ਇਨ ਸੋਸਾਇਟੀ, ਕਿ ਆਦਮੀ ਇੱਕ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਰੇਪ ਕਰੇ, ਲੜਕੇ ਨੂੰ,
ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮਾਰੇ ਪੀਟੇ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ, ਦੇਖੋ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਵਿਦਿਨ ਰੀਜ਼ਨ ਚਪੇੜ ਮਾਰਨੀ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਮਾੜੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੀ, ਕਿ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਾਉਣਾ। ਇੱਕ ਕਾਲੀ ਜੁੱਤੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ, ਆਪ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜ਼ਿਕਰ ਕੀਤਾ, ਡਰ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ, ਇੰਨੀ ਰਿਸਪੈਕਟ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ ਮਾਂ ਬਾਪ ਦੀ। ਔਰ ਉਹਦੀ ਨਿਗਾਹ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਬੱਚਾ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਕੁਝ ਗਲਤ ਕੀਤਾ। ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਕੋਈ ਬੱਚੇ ਬੈਠੇ ਹੋਣਗੇ ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਹੁਣੇ ਆਏ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਬੱਚੇ ਵੱਲ ਘੂਰ ਕੇ ਦੇਖੋ, ਉਹਨੇ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਵਾਈ ਯੂ ਸਟੇਰਿੰਗ ਐਟ ਮੀ, ਵਾਈ ਯੂ ਲੁਕਿੰਗ ਐਟ ਮੀ। ਪਰ ਉਹ ਬੱਚਾ ਸੋਚਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਇੰਨੀ ਬਰੇਵਰੀ ਆ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਵਿੱਚ। ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਰਿਸਪੈਕਟ ਬੜੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੀ ਪੇਰੈਂਟ ਦੀ, ਅੱਖ ਦੇ ਇਸ਼ਾਰੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਬੱਚੇ ਸਮਝ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਸੀ। ਪਤਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਟੱਡੀ ਕਰਨਾ, ਸਾਡੇ ਪੇਰੈਂਟਸ ਟੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਕਮਾਈ ਕਰਦੇ, ਸਾਡੀ ਪ੍ਰਾਈਵੇਟ ਫੀ ਭਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਅਸੀਂ ਪੜ੍ਹਨਾ ਔਰ ਮੈਕਸਿਮਮ ਰਿਜ਼ਲਟ 90% ਤੋਂ ਘੱਟ ਹੋਣਾ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਡਰਨਾ। ਹਰ ਵੇਲੇ ਵੀ ਹੈਡ ਦੈਟ ਫੀਲਿੰਗ ਆਫ ਗੈਟਿੰਗ ਦ ਬੈਸਟ, ਸਾਡੇ ਮਾਂ-ਬਾਪ ਖੁਸ਼ ਹੋਣ। ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ ਬੱਚੇ ਇੰਨੇ ਬਰੇਵ ਹੋ ਗਏ ਨੇ ਐਂਡ ਆਊਟਸਪੋਕਨ।
ਯੂਕੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚਪੇੜ ਮਾਂ-ਬਾਪ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ,
ਪਹਿਲਾਂ
ਮਾਰ ਨਹੀਂ
ਤਾਂ
ਸਕਦੇ।
ਚਾਈਲਡ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਤਾਂ ਸਕੂਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ, ਬੈਲਟ ਮਾਰਨੀ ਜਾਂ ਫੁੱਟ ਰੂਲਰ, ਕੇਨ। ਸਾਡੇ ਖੁਦ ਕੀਨੀਆ ਸਕੂਲ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਪਨਿਸ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਮਿਲੀ ਸੀ, ਸਵਾਹੀਲੀ ਸਾਡੀ ਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਲੈਂਗੁਏਜ ਉੱਥੇ ਸੀਗੀ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਨੀ ਪਈ ਸੀਗੀ। ਸਮਹਾਉ ਮੈਂ ਹੱਸੀ, ਕਿਸੇ ਨੇ ਜੋਕ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਤੇ ਮੇਰੇ ਫੁੱਟਾ ਪਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ, ਉਹ ਲੱਕੜੀ ਦਾ। ਉਹ ਲਾਈਫ 'ਚ ਕਦੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਭੁੱਲਾਂਗੀ। ਜਾਂ ਪਨਿਸ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰੀ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ, ਦੋਨੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਕੰਨ ਖੜ ਕੇ ਕੁਰਸੀ ਤੇ ਖੜਨਾ। ਉਹ ਪਨਿਸ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, ਹੈ ਨਾ।
ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਕੋਈ ਬੱਚਾ ਇਹਦਾ ਸਾਹਮਣਾ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਅਸੀਂ ਮਦਦ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ, ਪਤਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ? ਦੇਖੋ
ਬੱਚੇ ਦੇ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਬੜੇ ਕੰਪਲੈਕਸ ਆ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਬੱਚਾ ਡਰ ਕੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਬੋਲਦਾ ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਆਫ ਸੈਕਸ਼ੂਅਲ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਕੇ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਰਦਾ ਨਾ, ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਪੇਸ਼ੈਂਟਸ ਆਏ ਨੇ ਬੇਟਾ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਭਰਾ ਨੇ 3 ਭੈਣਾਂ ਨੂੰ 8 ਸਾਲ ਰੇਪ ਕੀਤਾ, ਪਰ ਉਹਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੀਸਰੀ ਭੈਣ ਨੂੰ ਰੇਪ ਕੀਤਾ, ਉਹਨੇ ਗਲੇ ਤੇ ਚਾਕੂ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ, ਪੇਰੈਂਟਸ ਘਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, ਐਂਡ ਉਹਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਸੀ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਮਾਰ ਸਿੱਟਾਂਗਾ। ਉਹ ਕੁੜੀ ਨੇ ਚੀਕ ਮਾਰੀ ਕਿ ਰੱਬ ਕਰੇ ਤੇਰੇ ਕਦੀ ਬੱਚਾ ਨਾ ਹੋਵੇ। ਔਰ ਖੁਦਾ ਦੀ ਕਸਮ ਨਾਲ ਅੱਜ ਤੱਕ ਗੋਇੰਗ ਬੈਕ ਦੇ ਹੈਵ ਨੈਵਰ ਹੈਡ ਚਿਲਡਰਨ। ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿੰਨੇ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਦੀ ਯਾਤਰਾ ਕੀਤੀ ਔਰ ਉਹਨੇ ਸਿਰਫ ਕਾਲੀ ਮਾਤਾ ਦੀ ਤਸਵੀਰ ਦੇਖ ਕੇ ਚੀਕ ਮਾਰੀ ਸੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਨੇ, ਜਦੋਂ ਹੀ ਵਾਸ ਰੇਪਿੰਗ ਹਿਸ ਯੰਗੈਸਟ ਸਿਸਟਰ, ਐਂਡ ਸ਼ੀ ਸੈਡ ਦੈਟ ਕਰਸ। They came to me for a child, ਔਰ ਮੈਂ ਉਹ ਖੁਦ ਉਹ ਲੜਕੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਮੋਸ਼ਨਲ ਟਰੋਮੇ ਚੋਂ ਕੱਢਿਆ। 2 ਤਾਂ ਅਨਬੈਲੈਂਸ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ, ਇੱਕ ਨੇ ਸ਼ਾਦੀ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ, was not balanced as well, and till today they have not had a child.
So ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਹੋ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਹੈ? ਡਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ,
ਡਿਪਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ, obsessive eating, ਬੱਚਾ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਹਾਰਮ ਕਰੇਗਾ ਜਾਂ ਟ੍ਰੇਨ ਜੰਪ ਕਰੇਗਾ ਜਾਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਖਾਣਾ ਖਾਏਗਾ, ਜਾਂ ਖਾਏਗਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਜਾਂ ਕਬਜ਼ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਜਾਂ ਹਰ ਵੇਲੇ ਕਹੇਗਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਮੈਂ ਜਾਣਾ ਨਹੀਂ, ਮੇਰਾ ਢਿੱਡ ਦੁਖਦਾ, ਸਕੂਲ ਐਬਸੈਂਟੀ। all these signals, हाँ, or not productive in school, attention span सही नहीं हैगी या
कुछ ना कुछ गलत लग रहा है,
जाओ फिर नशे लैंड लपेगा, some way to hide his anxiety or her anxiety। सिर्फ लड़कियां नाल नहीं है, child abuse can be of so many kinds, you know। घर विच जे आपां पहलों कहा सीगा माँ बाप दी आपस विच प्यार नहीं होएगा ते माँ बच्चे नाल रुखा बोलेगी ते, you know, and there's no pleasantness, प्यार नहीं है, that is also a form of child abuse of a different kind।
So आपां जे ਕਿਸੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਮਦਦ ਕਿੰਦਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ? ਕੌਣ ਸੇ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਨੈਟਵਰਕਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ?
Again, there are so many schools that are willing to listen to you, schools ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ nurses ਹੈਗੀਆਂ ਆ, there are helpers in school that will listen to you। ਡਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਦਾਂਗੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਮਾਪੇ ਤੋਂ ਛੁੱਟ ਜਾਾਂਗੇ। So many children live in fear for years and years and years on end। 16-20 years later you'll find out ਕਿ my God, ਇੰਨੇ ਸਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਚੁੱਪ ਕੇ ਰਹੇ, only not to break up the family, only not to lose their siblings because of a social services ਨੇ ਪਰੇ ਕਰ ਦੇਣਾ।
ਚਾਈਲਡ ਲਾਈਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ,
ਚਾਈਲਡ ਹੈਲਪਲਾਈਨ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ, they listen to you।
ਸਿੱਖ ਹੈਲਪਲਾਈਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਨੇ।
Yes, very well, and all these are free phone helplines, they are there to help you children, reach out to them, discuss ਤੁਹਾਡੇ issues। ਕਈ ਵਾਰੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਘਰ ਨਾਰਮਲ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਰੇਜ਼ ਕਰੋਗੇ ਐਸ ਚਿਲਡਰਨ ਇਹ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼, ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਸੁਧਾਰ ਹੋ ਜਾਵੇ ਉਸ ਘਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਐਂਡ ਯੂ ਹੈਵ ਸੇਵਡ ਯੋਰ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ, ਯੂ ਹੈਵ ਸੇਵਡ ਯੋਰਸੈਲਫ ਫਰਮ ਸੋ ਮਚ ਟਰਾਮਾ। ਐਂਡ ਉਹ ਬੱਚੇ ਦੀ ਪਰਵਿਸ਼ ਜੇ ਸਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਉਹਦੀ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਈ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਮੀ ਹੋਏਗੀ, ਹੀ ਵਿਲ ਨਾਟ ਬੀ ਏਬਲ ਟੂ ਪਰਫਾਰਮ ਇਨ ਸਕੂਲ, ਹੀ ਵਿਲ ਬੀ ਅ ਡਰੋਪ ਆਊਟ। ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹੋਗੇ ਮੇਰਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਨਲਾਇਕ ਹੈਗਾ ਜਾਂ ਪੜ੍ਹਦਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਆ, ਦੂਸਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਈ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਪਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਇਹ ਦੇਖੋ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਘਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀ ਕਮੀ ਹੈ, ਜਾਂ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਫੈਕਟਰ ਕਰਕੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ। ਘਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚਪੇੜ ਵੀ ਮਾਰਨੀ ਸਹੀ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਹੀ ਟਾਈਮ ਠੀਕ ਵੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ। ਇਹਦੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਡਰ ਕੇ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਹੀ ਰਹੀਏ, ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਜੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਰੈਪਰੀਮਾਂਡ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰੋਗੇ, ਸੱਟ ਮਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦੀ ਬੇਟੇ, ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਪਰ ਮਾਂ ਦਾ ਦਿਲ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਦਾਦੀ ਫਿਰ ਪਿਆਰ ਕਰਦੀ, ਆ ਜਾ ਬੇਟਾ ਮੈਂ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਸਵੀਟ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਆ, ਮਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸੋਸ਼ਲ ਵਰਕ ਘਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਮੇਰੀ ਮੰਮੀ ਨੂੰ ਚਪੇੜ ਮਾਰੀ ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਦਾਦੀ ਕੋਲ ਪਿਆਰ ਲੈ ਲੈਣਾ, ਬਾਬੇ ਕੋਲ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਸਵੀਟ ਲੈ ਲੈਣੀ। ਐਂਡ ਥੀਸ ਥਿੰਗਸ ਸਮਟਾਈਮਸ ਡੋਂਟ ਐਗਜ਼ਿਸਟ ਇਨ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਹੋਮਸ ਵਿਦ ਅ ਚਾਈਲਡ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖੋ ਕਈ ਮਰਡਰਸ ਨਿਕਲੇ ਨੇ, ਬੱਚੇ ਦੰਬੇ ਰਹਿ ਗਏ ਨੇ, ਸਮ ਆਫ them in slaughtered, ਸੈਡ ਕੇਸਿਸ। ਆਪਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤਨਹਾਈ ਹੈ ਨਾ ਇਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ, ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਭੈੜੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਆ। ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਫੈਕਟਰ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਘਰ ਫੈਮਲੀਜ਼ ਵੀ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ, ਘਰ ਛੋਟੇ ਆ, ਵੀ ਹੈਵ ਟੂ ਡਿਸਇਨਗ੍ਰੇਟ ਫਰੋਮ ਆਵਰ ਬ੍ਰਦਰਸ ਐਂਡ ਆਵਰ ਅੰਕਲਸ ਐਂਡ ਆਂਟਸ, ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਵੀ ਆਲ ਹੈਵ ਆਵਰ ਓਨ ਸੈਪਰੇਟ ਹੋਮਸ ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਵੀ ਡੋਂਟ ਇੰਟਰਮਿਕਸ। ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੱਚਾ ਵੀ ਇਕੱਲਾ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਂਦਾ, ਹੀ ਕੈਨ ਨਾਟ ਡਿਸਕਸ ਵਿਦ ਹਿਸ ਕਜ਼ਨ ਕਿ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮੰਮੀ ਨੇ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਜਾਂ ਮੇਰੇ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਆ ਕੁਛ ਹੁੰਦਾ। ਦੇ ਬਿਕਮ ਹਿਡਨ ਫੈਕਟਰਸ, ਹੈ ਨਾ।
ਆਪਾਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਕਦੀ ਕਦੀ ਦਾਦਾ ਜਾਂ ਤਾਇਆ ਇੰਦਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਨੇ,
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ।
ਤੇ ਜੇ ਆਪ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਆ ਫਿਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਉਹਦਾ ਸਾਹਮਣਾ ਕਿੱਦਾਂ ਲੈ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ, ਕਰਕੇ ਕਾਫੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਕਲਚਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੋਕੀ ਸ਼ਰਮ ਖਾ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ।
ਬਿਲਕੁਲ
ਸੋ ਕਿ ਸਾਡਾ ਤਾਇਆ ਸਾਡੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਦਾ ਰੇਪ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਇੰਦਾ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ, ਫਿਰ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਇਹਦਾ ਸਾਹਮਣਾ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ
ਕਈ ਤਾਂ ਪੇਰੈਂਟਸ ਔਰ ਮਦਰਸ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹੀ ਦਮ ਘੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਬੈਠ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਕੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਮੇਰੀ ਧੀ ਦੀ ਸ਼ਾਦੀ ਵੀ ਹੋਣੀ ਹੈ, ਦੱਸਦੀਆਂ ਨਹੀਂ। ਔਰ ਇਹ ਕੇਸਿਸ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਹੋਏ ਵੀ ਨੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬਾਹਰੋਂ ਰਿਸ਼ਤੇਦਾਰ ਜਾਂ ਗਿਆਨੀ ਬੁਲਾਏ ਨੇ ਔਰ ਉਹ ਗਿਆਨੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਖੁਦ ਹੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਰੇਪ ਕੀਤਾ। ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਤੱਕ ਚਲੋ ਲੜਕੀਆਂ ਦੀ ਸ਼ਾਦੀ ਹੋਈ ਪਰ ਉਹ ਘਰੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਸਟੋਰੀਆਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਗਈਆਂ ਫॉर द sheer shame। ਜਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸੀਗਾ, ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਜੇ ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪ੍ਰਾਹੁਣਾ ਆਇਆ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਆਪਣੀ ਧੀ ਨਾਲ ਕੀਤਾ, ਮੇਰੇ ਹਸਬੈਂਡ ਨੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਤਾਂ ਖੂਨ ਕਰ ਦੇਣਾ ਸੀ, ਇਹਨੇ ਜੇਲ੍ਹ 'ਚ ਜਾਣਾ, ਸਾਡੀ ਸਾਰੀ ਲਾਈਫ ਟੁੱਟ ਜਾਣੀ ਸੀ, ਇਹਦੋਂ ਬੈਟਰ ਸਾਰੀ ਚੀਜ਼ ਤੇ ਢੱਕਣ ਹੀ ਰਹਿਣ ਦਿਓ ਔਰ ਕੁੜੀ ਦਾ ਮੂੰਹ ਬੰਦ ਹੀ ਰਵੇ। ਐਂਡ ਉਹ ਟਾਈਮ ਪਾ ਕੇ ਕੁੜੀ ਤੋਂ ਨਿਕਲੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਸਟੋਰੀ, ਉਹ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਈ ਸਟੋਰੀ, ਸ਼ੀ ਸਟਿਲ ਕੈਰਿੰਗ ਦੈਟ ਹੋਲ ਟਰਾਮਾ ਇਨ ਹਰ ਲਾਈਫ। ਯਾ ਸੋ ਇਹ ਫੈਕਟਰਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਨੇ ਸਮਟਾਈਮਸ ਦੇ ਹੈਵ ਟੂ ਬੀ ਡਿਸਕਸ, ਬਟ ਜਨਾਨੀਆਂ ਖਾਸ ਕਰ ਇਹ ਸ਼ਰਮ ਦੇ ਮਾਰੇ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਘਰੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਨਿਕਲਦੀਆਂ। ਪਰ ਕੀ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ? Keep your children in safe environment and be friends. ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਦੋਸਤੀ ਪਾਓ, but always keep an eye on your children. ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ, ਇੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਡਰ ਕੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਕੂਲ ਤੱਕ ਤਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਗੇਟ ਤੱਕ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਸਕੂਲਸ ਹੈਵ ਬਿਕਮ ਫੋਰਟ੍ਰੈਸਿਸ, ਦੇ ਆਰ ਪ੍ਰਿਜ਼ਨਸ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੱਕ ਬਜ਼ਰ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਫਿਰ ਦੂਸਰੇ ਬਜ਼ਰ 'ਚ ਜਾਂਦੇ, ਫਿਰ ਸਾਈਨ ਇਨ ਕਰਦੇ, ਫਿਰ ਸਾਈਨ ਆਊਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਪਿਓਰਲੀ ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰੇਪਿਸਟ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ ਜਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੀਡੀਫਾਈਲਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਨੇ, ਪੀਡੋਫਾਈਲਸ, ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਫਿਲਮਾਂ ਬਣਾਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਦੀਆਂ, ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗਰੂਮਿੰਗ ਆ, ਗਰਲ ਗਰੂਮਿੰਗ ਸਟੋਰੀਜ਼ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਿਆ। ਔਰ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਖਾਸ ਕਰ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀਆਂ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਪਲੀਜ਼। ਅਸੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਬੇਟਾ ਇੰਨੇ ਚੁਸਤ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ ਆਪਣੇ ਟਾਈਮ 'ਚ, ਅਸੀਂ ਬੰਦੇ ਦੇ ਇਸ਼ਾਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਜਾਤ ਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਾਂ ਹਿੰਦੂ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਮੁਸਲਮਾਨ ਜਾਂ ਸਿੱਖ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਈਸਾਈ ਹੈ। ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ੍ਹ ਇਹ ਬੱਚਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੱਗਦਾ। ਸੋ ਗਰਲ ਗਰੂਮਿੰਗ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਅਬਿਊਜ਼ ਬੜਾ ਹੋ ਰਿਹਾ ਨੇ। ਔਰ ਉਹ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਕਿਉਂ ਡੁੱਬ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ ਉਹ ਪਿਆਰ 'ਚ? ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਪਿਆਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਿਆ,
ਘਰ 'ਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਿਆਰ ਮਿਲਿਆ। ਔਰ
ਉਹ ਚੀਜ਼ਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਗੱਡੀਆਂ ਦਿਖਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ, ਜੁਐਲਰੀ ਦਿਖਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ, ਹੌਲੀਡੇ ਲੈ ਲੈਂਦੇ, ਡੂ ਲਿਟਲ ਹੌਲੀਡੇਜ਼। ਮੈਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਇੰਨਾ ਵਧੀਆ ਦੇਸ਼ ਹੈਗਾ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਛੁੱਟੀ ਕਰਨੀ ਇੰਗਲੈਂਡ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਡਜ਼ਨਟ ਹੈਵ ਟੂ ਬੀ ਵੈਰੀ ਐਕਸਪੈਂਸਿਵ। ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਓ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ, ਮੇਬੀ ਟੂ ਦ ਸੀ ਸਾਈਡ। ਇਟ ਡਜ਼ਨਟ ਹੈਵ ਟੂ ਬੀ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇੰਡੀਆ ਹੀ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਾਓ ਘਰ ਟੂ ਘਰ। ਟਾਈਮ ਦਿਓ ਆਪਣੇ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ, ਸਿਟ ਡਾਊਨ, ਟਾਕ ਟੂ ਯੋਰ ਚਿਲਡਰਨ, ਗਿਵ them ਟਾਈਮ। ਐਂਡ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟਾਈਮ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਦੀ ਵੀ ਮੁੜਕਾ, ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਬੱਚਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਹੋਈ ਜਾਣਾ ਉਹਨੇ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਕੁਆਇਟ ਹੋਈ ਜਾਣਾ, ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਉਹਦੇ ਹੋਰ ਆਈਡੀਆਜ਼ ਚੇਂਜ ਹੋ ਜਾਣੇ, ਉਹਦੀ ਫਰੈਂਡਸ਼ਿਪ ਵੱਧ ਜਾਣੀ ਆ ਬਾਹਰ ਦੇ ਸਰਕਲ ਨਾਲ। ਔਰ ਉਹ ਫਿਰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਕਦੀ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਰਿਲੇਸ਼ਨਸ਼ਿਪ, ਜਿਹੜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਰਿਲੇਸ਼ਨਸ਼ਿਪ 4 ਸਾਲ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਸੁਰਤ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਹੈ 18 ਸਾਲ ਤੱਕ ਬੱਚੇ ਨਾਲ ਬਣਾਣੀ, ਉਹ ਸਟਿਗਮਾ ਅਟੈਚ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਨਹੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਬੱਚਾ ਗਵਾ ਲਿਆ। ਬਟ ਕਮ ਬੈਕ ਟੂ ਦ ਸੇਫ Sikhi principles. Make sure your child is instilled with Sikhism in his, that he's proud or she's proud to stand in society and say, this is how I am and this is how you will accept me. ਮੇਰੇ ਖੁਦ ਬੱਚੇ ਸਿੰਘ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਔਰ ਖੁੱਲੇ ਦਾੜੇ ਨਾਲ, my ਬੱਚਾ went to a French company and he wrote a 2-page letter ਕਿ yes, I'll accept this contract of joining the company as long as I have all these Sikh holidays. I will come with my khulla dada, I will wear a tie, boot, suit. And the French company had to accept him. So, ਆਪਣੇ ਆਪ ਦੀ ਰਿਸਪੈਕਟ ਨਾ ਗਵਾਓ। Be who you are, what you are. Be proud of who you are. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
1 2 1 2
1 2 1 2.
It's good. Does the sound all right?
1 by 1, please. 1 by 1.
Hello. 1 2 3. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
Okay. Next, please.
1 2 1 2.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I would really like to get involved in NSPC, either in London or in Birmingham.
Ready?
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
3, 2, 1, stop.
Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ji Ki Fateh. Mera naam Manjinder Singh hai. Today we're here with NSPC, with Dr. Ash Chand, talking about child abuse. I'd like to welcome you to the show, Dr. Ash.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about NSPC itself as well?
Sure. So I'm Head of Strategy and Development at the NSPCC. The NSPCC stands for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Okay.
It's a national charity that covers all of the United Kingdom, and our main function is to prevent and protect children from child abuse.
Okay.
And we do that in a range of ways, from offering frontline services for children and their families, right through to policy, through to research, and through to working with other organisations and government departments.
Okay, before we get into the actual issues of child abuse, can you tell me more about yourself and what made you work for NSPC and the work that you do
Sure.
that's integral to it?
The NSPCC has a number of themes. It has 7 themes that underpins much of its work. And broadly speaking, those themes are broken down into 2 areas. One is about different forms of abuse that children experience, and so sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and physical abuse. And then the other side is looking at vulnerable children, different groups of vulnerable children, one of which is what we call minority ethnic children. So that in this country, that's South Asian children, African and Caribbean children, and mixed heritage children. And my role is to focusing on those vulnerable children to see what we can do to improve practice, policy, research, to make sure they're better protected.
So you mainly focus on minority
Yes.
ethnic children.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more of the issues that are faced there, more so than with, say, the general population?
Sure. Much of what we do is based on evidence, and we've known for more than 10 years now that in terms of child protection and child abuse, minority ethnic children are underrepresented or overrepresented, so disproportionately represented in child abuse statistics. And basically what that means is that South Asian children, for example, are underrepresented on a national level when we look at different forms of abuse.
Okay.
And that's worrying because we need to know why they're underrepresented. Because what we know from researchers is that ethnicity and religion isn't related to child abuse. So we expect across the country for the rates to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
And if any group of children based on ethnicity is under or overrepresented, then we need to ask the question, why is that? Is it about communities not coming forward? Is it about statutory agencies themselves, local authorities not working with families as they should? Is it language? Is it culture? What are the issues that then cause that?
So before we go furthermore into that, about what sort of issues there are there, can we talk about child abuse and sexual abuse itself?
Okay.
What is it, how we can identify it, and what are the main sort of aspects of it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, in England and the United Kingdom, child abuse is really broken down into 4 areas. Sexual abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and physical abuse. And there's lots of kind of guidance and information about what constitutes each of those. So physical abuse, of course, as it sounds, is hitting and hurting a child to cause injury. Sexual abuse is where you obviously have inappropriate sexual relationships with a child. Very clear laws in this country about how old a young person can be before they can have a sexual relationship, particularly with an adult. And then neglect is where a child's needs are not being met because kind of the environment or the support is not offered by parents or family or others to make sure that they're able to thrive in a stable home.
So that's like food and shelter,
Yeah,
etc., etc.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally emotional abuse, where children aren't given the kind of security, the love, the emotional support they need to thrive and develop a good sense of self and self-esteem and self-worth.
So going back to the previous question, so with South Asian kids, there's a disproportionate or an overproportionate...
Underrepresented they are.
Yeah, underrepresented. So what things are we finding out about in these areas, these 4 areas that you've
Okay.
talked about, that are happening in the community?
Well, it's first of all, I should say that the research into disproportionality and minority ethnic children generally is sparse. There's not a huge amount of information out there. What we do know and only kind of recently in terms of kind of government reports, is that South Asian children, and they don't particularly break it down in terms of Pakistani, Bangladeshi or Indian, they generally use the term South Asian or Asian, are underrepresented by at least half their numbers than what's in the population. So for example, if we have 8% of children 0 to 17 that from South Asian backgrounds in England, then roughly 4% or less will be represented in child abuse, child protection statistics. Does that make sense?
That does. But why is there that difference?
Okay, so why is that difference? There's no simple answer to that.
Okay.
And there's obviously ourselves, the NSPCC, but lots of other people have looked to why might there be a difference. Some talk about a systems issue or a system bias where with the best will in the world, children's services departments, police and other agencies that are responsible for child protection sometimes don't intervene in cases involving South Asian families because of mistaken beliefs or stereotypes or myths.
They think it's cultural and they shouldn't get involved.
Absolutely. They might think it's cultural. They might think the families can take care of themselves and deal with their issues themselves. There might be issues about language which are not easy to resolve, so they can't fully understand through assessment, to try and talk with the family what the issues are.
So are these South Asian children much more vulnerable and at risk, for instance, compared to the general population?
Yeah, absolutely. Because so the argument is because ethnicity and religion is not linked to rates of child abuse, then if a whole group are underrepresented and have been for a very long time, so these are government statistics as well as other research studies, then the reality is that for some reason they are not being properly protected in society and in the communities.
So what can parents at home or family members or children at home, what are the signs to look out for to find out whether someone is being experiencing child abuse or sexual abuse? Because if the authorities are failing as such or not identifying these things, what can we do at home to be able to
well, absolutely. I mean, I think the short answer to that is where you have any concern or worry about any child or young person is to talk to somebody about it. And you can talk to us at the NSPCC, and I can give you our helpline, who you can call, and there's a counsellor on the other end who will talk to any adult or professional if they've got any concerns. But the thing about child abuse is difficult for me to just give you particular signs or symptoms because it's such a vast range, and with some things like physical abuse, it may be very obvious. You see a mark on a child or they've been injured and hurt and it's been caused by an adult or a family member, then of course that's much more obvious, and anybody that sees that should report that. But with things like emotional abuse and neglect, it might be more difficult because there may be no one particular cause or incident which identifies that abuse. It may be something that is chronic, happens over a longer term, and then people are slightly worried about why is that child behaving like that? Why have they become withdrawn? Why have they become isolated? And so my view would be is where you have any concern, then do talk to us or anybody else who's a professional and voice those concerns.
Why does child abuse happen? Is there any sort of definitive reasons behind it? Is it perpetuated by cultural beliefs more so in our society, in the South Asian communities? Is there more of that? Do you think there's more of that happening there? Or?
Why does child abuse happen is not an easy question to answer, and like I say, it's not. I would not say it's cultural or religious at all, really. I mean, I think adults in most cases of child abuse kind of minimise the abuse that they're doing to children. Sometimes they don't believe that they're actually harming the child when in fact they are. And thankfully in a few number of cases there are, but only in a few, there are obviously adults, parents and others who deliberately harm their children to make them suffer. And of course children can die as a consequence of child abuse. But why? It could be psychological, there could be societal pressures, there could be mental health issues, there could be drug and alcohol issues, there could be issues of domestic violence in households. So there's a whole range of reasons really about what makes children vulnerable to child abuse and the kind of circumstances of adults in those particular situations.
Okay. Was there any other information that you wanted to share with us with NSPC's findings regarding South Asian child abuse, sexual abuse? Was
Sure.
there,
I think it's worth just kind of noting some of the statistics really,
Okay.
without dwelling on them too much. So just to get an idea, in 1 year up to March 2012, there was over 42,000 children who were kind of formally classified as being abused and are then placed on what's called a child protection plan.
that's all across the UK?
That's just in England.
And
That's just in England.
Any ethnicity?
Yeah, any
Okay.
ethnicity. And like I say, in terms of South Asian children, you know, you will then look at the proportion of those children in society, and what you would expect is that, you know, 6-7% that are South Asian would constitute, you know, that
Those
42,000.
statistics, yeah.
Yeah, but the reality is that's not the case.
How-
Less than half.
Less than a half.
Less
so
than half.
more than a half are not being reported.
Yeah, well, either not being reported, it's difficult to know whether they're not being reported or they're not being investigated. So do you see the difference? So, you know, any agency may get a report of concerns about children, and then the question then is what does that agency do to then take it further and investigate that allegation of abuse? Or it may be that it's actually the reporting itself. You know, children, for different reasons, don't say to adults about issues about being abused because of fear about shame, about honour, which we do know exists, because they don't want to upset their family, they don't, you know, want to, you know, bring any kind of outside of agencies involved into their families and communities.
To their close-knit communities.
So yeah, absolutely, and so they're concerned about those kind of issues, and sometimes it's because, you know, children and young people as well as adults actually don't know what the system is in the UK for child welfare and protection.
Is NSPC trying to help with that? Are you trying to train the police officers, the support workers, the social workers?
Absolutely. We through awareness raising really, and particularly for minority ethnic children across the board, we work hard to raise a profile of what child welfare and protection means, and really trying to help communities understand how to recognise child abuse, what it means, and who they can turn to for help if they have any concerns about children and young people. And of course, we also focus on children and young people themselves to make sure that they feel confident about being able to disclose any abuse that they might have suffered to professionals or to us at the NSPCC, and know that, you know, we will help them through whatever problems they have.
Well, you have a lot of campaigns that are quite in your face or like out there on TV and in posters, which I guess helps to bring awareness and make people aware. Do you do programs in schools as well for children to be able to?
We do. We have a school service which as it sounds, goes to all the different schools, largely secondary schools, to talk to children and young people in their classrooms, very low key, about, you know, kind of child welfare and, you know, good relationships and you know, kind of what they can expect, what their rights are, if you like, growing up as a child and young person in society, and what to do if they have concerns or worries. But we feel that's important, that children know kind of what the basis of what they can expect in kind of growing up in a family, in society, in communities, so that if they experience anything other than that, they know that, you know, they might need some help or support or need to talk to somebody about it.
That's great. Is there any more statistics that you wanted to share, or any other sort of facts from the NSPC or findings?
The only other one to share is that the most vulnerable children are those under 5, so 1 to 4, across all child abuse, and South Asian communities will be part of that. And part of that vulnerability is because those children aren't at school yet, so 1 to 4 or 0 to 4. And so there's kind of less professionals involved who can kind of identify children who seem to be at risk of significant harm or abuse, and so, you know, then can take appropriate action. Because there's fewer professionals involved generally when a child's under 5, it can be more difficult to identify and then you know, investigate. And that's why we urge communities, families, to come forward if they have concerns about any children, either, you know, their own children or children who are other family members or in their community more widely.
So what are we talked about spotting the signs and stuff, but what kind of things people at home could be looking out for, even if it's maybe they're unaware, like you said some
Sure.
parents don't even think it's child abuse.
Sure.
So what are the legal aspects, like about how to discipline your child and what to look out for that parents might be accidentally doing, especially because some of our viewers are from other countries.
Absolutely.
Like India, and in India things are done differently, and
They
there've been
are.
many cases of parents who've come to the UK and then been, put into prison or whatever.
Sure.
So what are the outliners for that? please?
Okay, so if I focus on physical abuse and physical injury first, so in this country you're not allowed to hurt a child physically and leave a mark.
Okay.
Because that's assault. And so but it's slightly fudged by physical chastisement, which you are allowed. So you are allowed to physically chastise children
What
in
is
England,
chastisement?
where you can smack them,
Okay.
for example. But the threshold, if you like, which is not.
It's a very grey area.
It's a
isn't
very
it?
grey area, but the threshold is you can smack them, where it's appropriate, but you're not allowed to mark them, so cause a bruise or a scar or injury. But of course, the reality is, in most cases of kind of physical injury and physical abuse, is where parents have really hurt their children. They used an implement, a stick, a shoe, some of the to really kind of mete out physical injury to their children, and the answer to that is it's illegal and it's child abuse. And if authorities find out and the child makes an allegation, then by law professionals need to investigate and look to protect the child. And whatever parents might think about their rights in terms of parenting and their rights over their children, the reality is we have some very clear laws in this country about what you can and can't do with children. And so for physical injury and physical abuse, we are very clear about that. I have to say, in the NSPCC, we don't support even physical chastisement. We say, find other ways of reprimanding your children that doesn't involve physical violence. Because there's lots of studies out there that question what effect physical violence has against children in terms of discipline or chastisement, and studies out there that will say actually it often causes more harm than good, and B, children often need an adult to explain to them what they're doing wrong rather than someone just lashing out them.
So would you say one of the best ways was to talk to the child?
Absolutely. Explain what you think they've done wrong, have that discussion, have that dialogue, particularly in South Asian communities. I understand my own parents kind of worry that when their children, particularly if they're born in the United Kingdom, have to straddle two cultures, the culture of being within England and the UK, and of course the culture and traditions from their own Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi background.
So they have lots of fear that the child's going to become too Western, perhaps?
Too Western, absolutely.
And they have to reprimand, discipline, and keep them in line with their...
Yes, and that's a mistake. Any parent where you make a decision to settle in another country, particularly in another country which is very different from the South Asian countries, which the UK is, needs to expect that their children are going to grow up experiencing two cultures. And in my view, they should be looking to kind of celebrate that difference, celebrate that breadth of kind of experience and knowledge and learning that their children will have. And there'll be things that you don't agree with and don't like, but actually, as the parents and the family, you made the decision to do that. And I think it's important that you recognise that children have to navigate quite a difficult path to make sure that they feel like they belong, in the country, as well as they kind of uphold and respect the values and cultures of their parents and family.
That's an interesting point, because I've spent about a year in India, and I have found that my parents' generation that came from India like 30, 40 years ago have maintained their culture that was then present at that time, historically. In India, people have modernized, changed, even in the villages, things have developed in such a way they want to become so Western. And I sometimes find that my parents' generation are more backward here, in a sense.
True.
And people there were very... confused. You live in the West, you should be more Western, and you should be, we expect this and that and the other. They don't realize that actually, from my experience, parents of my generation in the UK are far more stricter than the parents in India.
Yeah.
So there is that sort of backlash. And then when parents from here go back to India, they realize that India is different. It's not that India that was there 40, 50 years ago when they were children.
Yeah.
That's just an imaginary image that's long gone.
Yeah, it's true. I would agree with that completely. And those people who have been recently to Mumbai or Delhi will see, big metropolitan cities that are, could be anywhere in the Western world.
Yeah,
and, the values are very similar to Western values. And young people growing up in those major cities in India are very similar to the young people here. They like the same kind of thing, music, issues with their parents.
I find they have more freedom than children here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going back to the other points, you've done physical violence.
Yeah, and sexual abuse, of course, is about relationships or not that children may have, particularly with adults, which adults need to be aware of. So the general, there's laws in this country, so no child, for example, 13 or under is allowed to have a sexual relationship with anybody.
Is it 13 and under?
Is allowed to have a sexual relationship with anybody and can't give consent. And then above 13, there's this issue of consent, but it becomes a bit grey, particularly if it's with like a girlfriend and boyfriend of similar age.
Does the person have to be of similar age or at 13?
Yeah, well, I mean,
After
basically,
13.
under the age of 16, children shouldn't be having any form of sexual relationship. It's just about how kind of the police and other people investigate that. So if a child's 14, 15, kind of 16, and they're having a relationship with a peer who's a similar age, then they might look at that in a different way than if they were having a relationship with an adult. Does that make sense? But the
Or
reality...
what if they were having a relationship with someone who was younger than 13?
Yeah, well, that's still
that'd be
illegal. That's illegal.
Okay.
So because of this whole issue about consent, so that would still be illegal. So the short answer is 16 and above is when young people can have sexual relationships. But even then, the reality is it's not so much about sexual relationships per se. It's about the power within those relationships and who has that power.
It's a control thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sexual abuse.
So sexual abuse is about control and exploitation. So you may have heard quite recently about cases of child sexual exploitation in the media about young girls being abused by groups and gangs of men. And that's
sexual grooming that's going on in our
absolutely.
communities.
So that's all about child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse. And in some of those instances, there will have been people in the community that knew what was happening to those girls. And these were, some of the reports about white girls, but it happens to all girls, including girls from South Asian backgrounds, which may be kind of less talked about in terms of the media, but it does happen.
But in our communities itself, like sexual abuse or sexual relations is generally not discussed. And a lot of the older generation think that only after marriage that should be happening. So when they put those markers so high up to that age, then if anything happens before that, they kind of ignore it.
Yeah.
So do you find that there's a need to kind of face up to the fact that might happen and kids might be sexually active before marriage?
Absolutely. And remember, in terms of sexual activity, we are talking about abuse too.
Yeah.
So they may be vulnerable to sexual abuse and indeed being abused. And, whatever your culture or background, one would hope that if you're a parent, you'd be able to talk to your son or daughter about any aspect openly, so that you feel that you could protect them if you felt in any way, shape or form,
rather than ignoring the issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, in terms of kind of sexual relationships, lots of parents across all different ethnic groups and cultures struggle to talk about kind of sexual relationships with young people, their sons and their daughters. So it's not unique to South Asian community.
Because they still see them as children, don't they?
They still see them as children, and it's quite difficult to see your children growing up into adolescents and adults, and then of course forming relationships in that way. But I think it's really important that they have or try to have a kind of open discussion, kind of acknowledging that, this is not what things were like 40, 50 years ago, if that's what their experience is, particularly in a different country like India or Pakistan. It's what young people, experiment. And perhaps they've always experimented. Perhaps the only difference is it's more prevalent in terms of people coming forward to talk about it.
Yeah, more people are open about it.
Being open about it. But yeah, I mean, I would say have the discussion. I think one of the key issues for me that we struggle with is whether in Punjabi or in Hindi or Urdu, there's actually words that people can use to actually talk about sexual activity.
And whether their children understand those words.
Absolutely.
Because we have a generation now which don't speak those languages.
That's right. And indeed, whether adults actually know what they are. And I'm not talking about profanity. I'm not talking about swear words, because, there are lots of swear words. But if I asked any Asian person watching this show today, how would you talk about, sexual relationships,
they may not have the words to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. They may not actually have the words to talk about it. And in terms of child abuse and child protection, that raises a real issue, because, of course, when we're working with young people, particularly South Asian young people and their parents, and they speak little or no English and we have to use interpreters, then the question is, how confident are we that if it's about sexual abuse, for instance, and all the activities and words we use around that both the interpreter and the parent knows what we're talking about. That there's a language there that actually enables us to talk about those kind of issues in a way that people can understand, so that we can then look at what protection might need to be put into place.
And then there's two more points, aren't there?
There is. So emotional abuse, as it sounds really, and it's making sure that we don't kind of demean or belittle children and young people so that they feel worthless.
Okay.
And kind of lose their self-esteem, and kind of some myths and stereotypes about, for example, Asian families and their views about girls over boys, and kind of preferential treatment. And it's really making sure, and some of them are stereotypical more than they're based on any kind of reality, but it's really making sure that people are conscious of, gender differences. People are conscious of how their culture or religions might perpetuate gender differences as a bias, and making sure that really, we're aware of that and thinking about, well, what effect might that have on our daughters, and what signals might we be giving as parents and communities, perhaps we don't even recognise it, that they're not as good as sons. And
in the South Asian community, the gender differences is still prevalent. It's still a big issue, more so than the white community, for instance, I would say.
Absolutely. But it has changed. And even in India and Pakistan, girls go off to university and they do study and they do go into occupations. So it's not even what it was, from our parents' generation, what they might have been used to kind of 30, 40, 50 years ago. But there is a gender difference. And I think that's something that really needs to be examined quite closely.
And then how do you find that with newly arrived immigrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh? Does their way of thinking, is it any different, or?
I think it's different, but largely it's the differences about not understanding what the UK context is around kind of child welfare, child protection, kind of family dynamics. And I think And if they speak little or no English, then that obviously has a huge impact, because it's not easy for them to then converse with different professionals or different people to ask for advice and support, particularly if they've got kind of concerns around their children, or even wanting to find a suitable school for them, or whatever it might be. It just makes everything much, much more difficult. And of course, if people like that feel isolated, feel stressed, then that stress and isolation in families will, affect all members of the families, including children and young people. And so, you can expect people to feel, that they're struggling in those kind of circumstances, and we all have to do whatever we can to try and ease some of that stress and alleviate some of the problems.
I've come across some cases where a family's newly arrived from India and they've been living here for a couple of years, but they're treating the oldest daughter in a very bad way and making her do all the cleaning and cooking and looking after the young children even though she's going to school, giving her emotional abuse, physical abuse, etc. And then all of a sudden the daughter decides to get up and leave and get support services involved. But then we have the issue of the community and the people who represent the gurdwaras and things like that, who are trying to intervene to bring the girl back because they think unification is better. And there seems to be sort of a lack of knowledge or sort of acknowledgement that the parents might have been in the wrong, or the girl might have been in the wrong, but that sort of legislation aspect with established community-based organisations that have been in the UK for a while who don't seem to understand, or I don't know, have you come across stuff like that?
We have
as
come
well?
across that quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of discourse around it, if not kind of research. So people have talked about it. I think the short answer is that Gurdwaras and other organisations need to be careful about how they intervene and the messages they're giving, because the tide is changing. At one time, different organisations, government departments kind of left minority ethnic communities alone to kind of get on with and didn't really focus on particular aspects. But that's changing. So one example is forced marriage. There's a new criminal act being introduced next year, very specifically on forced marriage, to make sure that girls, many of whom will be South Asian as well as from other cultures and ethnicities, don't feel that they've been forced into a marriage which they don't agree with, and that they don't want, and the new legislation will mean that if they make a complaint, police officers can investigate, other people can investigate and charge people, including family members, if they were involved in that form of abuse. And we've got to remember that it may sound kind of forced marriage that, it's just about marriage, but of course those young people can suffer a whole range of abuses, from physical abuse, from rape, so
before and after.
Before and after, including death, because of what families sometimes do to their sons and daughters in the name of trying to uphold honour or culture, and agencies like ourselves and the police and children's services will investigate, and you have to ask the families what honour there will be if police officers come knocking on your door, arrest you, and then you go through a court of law and found to be convicted of a form of child abuse.
What about children who are lesbian, gay or bisexual? Have you come across those as well, according to forced marriages or general abuse?
Children and young people who LGBT, as its shorthand, do come forward and do talk about some issues, but generally speaking, it's not the
NSPCC's main.
Not even NSPCC. They generally don't come out to generally talk about the sexual orientation necessarily as a distinct form of identity, and then wanting particular responses to it. Some people do, and the NSPCC and others make sure that whatever services we provide, whether it, that we are sensitive around their sexual orientation.
And do you work with a lot of different organisations to umbrella everything in together?
We do. So the Home Office has, for example, an advisory group called a vulnerable groups panel, which basically looks at all the different vulnerabilities that young people have. So ethnicity is one of them, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans is another. But whatever they may be, to make sure that the policies that are in place and the practices that are in place. Disability, absolutely, are sensitive and appropriate, so that we don't disadvantage children and young people further.
Okay, finalising to the last point that there was. After emotional...
Yeah, absolutely. So neglect, and as it sounds really, it's not simply about kind of deprivation and poverty. We know that lots of families live in poverty and deprivation, but it's really about where children's needs are kind of not put first, really, to make sure they have enough to eat. They live in a warm environment, and parents actually look out for their needs. So, they care for them in the way that one would expect. And it's not about making sure that they have everything. It's making sure that they have the basics so that they can develop into kind of, stable,
healthy,
healthy,
balanced individuals. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, the worst cases of neglect, for example, are where young people have been locked up into rooms for days, not being fed.
Do you get that in the Asian community as well?
We get them into all communities, absolutely.
Yeah. So if viewers back at home are saying, oh, this doesn't happen in our community.
It certainly does.
Sometimes there's a lot of ignorance involved with our communities who think they're maybe better, but it does happen.
Not only does it happen, I think going back to my earlier point about underrepresented Asian children in the system, what I think is that people aren't coming forward to report abuse that's happening in some Asian families, and we all need to take responsibility around that, because if we're not reporting it and we are concerned, then that means we are leaving children unprotected. Okay.
And then they're growing up as unbalanced adults.
Absolutely, and people who have been hurt and harmed.
And the cycle will continue.
Absolutely,
could continue.
And so it's really, and so it happens in Asian communities. And there have been deaths of Asian children, over the last decade.
And sometimes they're not that reported in the media. I find if it's, say, for example, a white child who's got missing or been abused or something's happened, it's a big story.
Yeah.
But if it's an Asian child, it's like a backstory sort of thing.
It's very difficult to know what kind of triggers some stories in the media, whether it's around ethnicity, whether it's around the kind of circumstances, around particular children that trigger. So it's difficult to know. Okay. But what I can tell you is that these 4 forms of abuse happen across all communities. First hand, when I was a social worker, they were happening in Asian communities. And the difference is sometimes what the response is, as you alluded to earlier, that the Asian families have to the authority and professionals, the involvement of Gurdwaras and other places, which sometimes doesn't help. It makes matters worse.
Yes.
And what I would be saying is, places like Gurdwaras and others have a responsibility to make sure that they are protecting their children and young people. This is the next generation. And if we don't protect them, then who will?
Okay. And finishing off, can we just summarize how to get support if a child is experiencing child abuse, sexual abuse at home, or if parents are concerned, or if family members are concerned that someone in their family is going through this? Can you please give us names, numbers, and
absolutely.
information?
So any child or young person out there who has any kind of concerns or worries around child welfare protection in the way we've described it, or bullying, anything, then they can call a 24/7 helpline, child line, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. And the number is 0800, so it's a free phone number, 0800 1111. So that's for any child or young person to call child line.
0800 1111.
0800 1111. And they can also go online and have an online conversation with a counsellor through Childline website. So it doesn't need to be just by telephone. And then any adult or professional who has a concern about any child can contact the NSPCC helpline to talk about any child or young person or any worries that they have about children and young person. And that number is 0808 800 5000.
0808 800 5000. Okay.
And of course, they don't only they can contact us, but there's a whole range of other people they can contact. We say to children and young people that if you'd rather speak to a trusted adult, like a teacher in school, then do that, and the teacher will know exactly what to do and will help them. Or they might want to speak to a close friend, and the friend can then help them contact us or somebody else. But do whatever they have to do to feel confident that they will get the support they need. And Childline and the adult helpline are confidential, so they don't need to give their names, they don't need to give their addresses. All they need to do is pick up the phone and we will talk them through
trained professionals will talk them through.
Absolutely, they're trained counsellors.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ashtand, for coming here today.
You're very welcome.
We've learnt that in our communities we need to keep things open and clear, and discuss with our children what's happening, and not to keep things in parda. And we're very thankful that you've come here today to join us. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I am Manjinder Singh, and today we are here with Michael May from Survivors UK. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm happy to be here, thank you.
Thank you for coming on our show about sexual violence and sexual abuse. Can you tell me a little bit more about Survivors UK?
Okay. So Survivors UK is the oldest of the charities in the UK that work with men who have experienced sexual violence.
Okay.
We've been operating for 26 years now.
Wow.
And our remit is that we provide a helpline which provides a national service for emotional support. And from our London base, we have one-to-one and group counselling.
Okay.
And we currently see probably between 50 and 55 people at any time. So any week, we'll be seeing 55 people for sessions.
Wow.
And we get referrals from between 150 and 200 men a year that want to come and see us just for counselling.
Do people just come from London area? Do they come from outside of London as
We've
well?
had some people come from, we had a client last year flying in from the Isle of Wight to have his weekly counselling because there was nothing there for him. But mainly, yeah, because of the geographical limitations, people come because they can access a London service.
And you only have one office in London, yeah?
Yeah,
Nowhere else in the UK?
Yes.
Can you tell us more before we go on about what is male sexual violence for our viewers at home?
So we tend to use sexual violation instead of sexual violence because the majority of the men that come to us were abused as children as opposed to raped as adults. And the context of what happened to them doesn't feel like a violent act happened to them. They were groomed into it, something that happened that was very difficult and very difficult and
Painful.
pervasive and painful to the person.
Okay.
Didn't necessarily include an act of what we think of as violence. They weren't struck, they weren't threatened with a knife, and so we use violation because it's a much more person-centered word.
So can you explain more to me about what is male sexual violation?
It's any form of behaviour against a boy or a man that involves a sexual context that is inappropriate, so where consent was not given.
Okay.
And for a young person, as a society, we believe that under the age of 16, you're not able to give consent. So the statutory rape is a blanket term. If you, as an older person, have sex with someone who is under the age of 16, you are immediately believed to have broken the law because they don't have the ability to give you consent.
Do you have any statistics as to how often this happens in the community?
Yes, so we know that at any time there are roughly 1.5 to 2 million men, adult men,
In the UK?
who are survivors of some form of sexual assault, either as children or as adults.
Okay.
If we're looking at London specifically, sexual violence against adult men as opposed to children, there are about 10,000 assaults a year, and they vary from inappropriate touching right through to penetrative rape. But if you work it out, it's about one every hour.
And what about in the Asian community or the Sikh community? Do you have any statistics or any cases that are happening in those communities?
So we don't monitor specifically within communities. So we know how many people of an Asian background come to see us, but we don't know within that how many are Sikh, how many are Punjabi, how many are Gujarati, how many.
So what about in the Asian community? What's the prevalence?
We know that in the last 5 years, we've seen a significant rise in the number of men coming to us who have come from Asian backgrounds.
Why is that?
We've done a fair amount of work actually in the last 3 years, especially to raise our profile. We've advertised in Asian Eye and other online resources specifically aimed at that community.
Mm-hmm.
Last year we ran the Real Men Get Raped advertising campaign, which was the first ever specifically male sexual violation public facing campaign across all of London. So it was in most London tube stations and we got very good press coverage.
Okay.
And as a result of that, we're seeing a broader range of ethnicities coming forward for help.
So a lot of the time sexual violation or abuse is directed towards women who are abused.
Yeah.
So it's, in my opinion, it's very rare for an organisation to focus on men. Are you the only organisation that focuses on this issue?
Well, so there's two parts to your question. The easy one is to say no, we're not. We're one of 5 nationally who are male specific, although there are about another 22 that will see both men and women.
Okay.
And yes, the level of assaults between men and women is disproportionate. Yeah, it happens much more to women than it does to men.
Okay.
As adults.
Is that
as
because...
children, it's a different story.
Okay.
So the statistics are that 1 in 4 girls will be assaulted as a girl. 1 in 6 boys will experience some form of sexual violation as a boy.
So it's very
it's
similar.
much closer.
Is that the statistics you said with adults, women were more likely? Is that because women are more likely to report it and men are more ashamed to report it?
So that's certainly a part of it. We know that men are 10 times less likely to report than women, and women only maybe 10% of them actually report what happened to them.
So the statistics themselves, we're not 100% sure.
They're unreliable, but we do know that the barriers for men, even men who experience childhood sexual abuse, are much greater than for women, because we still live in a society that says men have to be certain things. Men have to be strong, men have to be courageous, men have to be able to bear things, men have to be able to protect the people in their lives, especially women.
So the stereotypes of what a man is.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the beginning? So for child sexual abuse, what is it, how it happens, what are the causes, how we can, stop it, who are the people doing this?
So, like most forms of intimate violence, it happens within family and community settings.
Okay.
You are, in the same way that you are much more likely to be sexually assaulted by someone with whom you are in a relationship, you are much more likely to be sexually abused as a child by someone to whom you have a relation, a blood relation or not, someone who is trusted to have access to you.
Someone who lives with you, or someone who could also be coming into the home?
It can be someone coming into the home, but someone in a position of trust.
Okay.
So, I'm also of an Asian background, and I grew up in a household where aunties and uncles came all the time, and we were left in the care of many people. It's a very trusting world, it's a village kind of raising children kind of situation.
Yes.
So, but fundamentally, it's about access.
So who does this to these children?
You tend to hear much more about boys being assaulted by men, but 40% of boys abused in childhood are abused by women.
How are they abused?
Everything from...
This is sexual abuse.
We're talking about sexual abuse specifically, and it takes all sorts of different forms. We immediately assume that it informs some kind of penetration, that, as a boy you were penetrated by another man, or you were made to penetrate a woman or a girl. But it can be much more insidious than that. So sexual violation includes forcing a child to watch pornography. It includes inappropriate touching. It includes making a child be in the room with you as an adult when you're having sexual relations with someone else. Okay. Exposing them inappropriately to a sexualized situation can be very damaging in the longer term to children.
What effects does it have on children?
I'm not really in a position to talk about the effects on children, because as a service we see adults only.
So what effects does it have? What effects do adults experience who were abused as children? What can you see and say for that?
So it's as unfortunately as broad as the sky in many ways. So the most common things we see, especially in men: depression, self-harming. Often there is a predisposition to inappropriate contact with drugs and alcohol, anything to numb themselves. A really big problem is an inability to develop trust. So to have trusting relationships with people, especially in a sexual context. For men, there is a big question around how it affects them in terms of their sexuality. So if you were a straight man, does it mean that in some way you're still gay, especially if you had a physical reaction to what happened to you?
Can you explain that in detail, please?
Well, if you were a young person or an adult and someone is involving you in a physical sexual act.
A male or a female?
A male or a female, it doesn't matter. But you're being physically stimulated, then your body reacts. I mean, if you're an adult man often and you're being assaulted, you may get an erection. If someone is anally penetrating you and your prostate is being involved in that, you may ejaculate. If you're a child, the sensations that you have are the sensations of physical pleasure often. Those things...
So children can experience physical sensations.
Yes.
Prior to puberty.
Absolutely. I mean, we know that children as young as 4 years old, they don't masturbate to orgasm, but they masturbate because touching themselves in a sexual way gives them pleasure. Your body is designed so that being touched in a certain way gives you the appropriate response, which is pleasure. But when you put that response into the context of the shame that you feel, it creates insurmountable problems in terms of how you identify yourself.
Does it affect their sexuality in any stage?
There's no evidence that an experience of abuse as a child affects your sexual predisposition one way or the other.
So if you're a male and you were a child, a boy, and you were raped by a man, then as you get older, there's no necessity that you will become a homosexual or
not at all.
straight?
Not at all.
Okay.
So as an organisation, we do monitor the sexuality of our clients, and probably 75 to 80% identify as heterosexual.
Okay. Even if they were abused
Yeah.
by a man?
Yeah, and the vast majority coming to us were abused by men.
Okay.
There's no proof that there's any connection. But for them, there is a fear that it's true. And it's very complicated if you're a gay man and you've been abused as a child, because the question then becomes, am I only gay because this happened to me?
Okay. And what about the case where women are abusing the boys?
It's a very murky area from a societal point of view. I mean, if it's a young boy, then of course we have no question that that's a wrong thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a boy in puberty, we live with this myth of, oh, well, aren't you lucky? You've been indoctrinated by this knowing older woman.
Mm-hmm.
But from a psychological point of view, actually, it can be very damaging for someone who is young to be participating in sexual acts with someone significantly older than them. It affects their sense of being, it affects their sense of ability, it affects their sense of appropriateness. As human beings, we're designed to be having sexual experiences with someone of contemporary kind of age, because part of the process of maturation is about exploring together what it feels like to feel frightened to do these things and to overcome those fears, none of which can possibly happen when someone else is significantly more experienced and older.
So if we have viewers at home who are experiencing sexual abuse, what avenues of help are there for both boys and for men?
So for boys, the NSPCC and Childline are the very best place that you can go. You can call anonymously, you don't have to say anything. You could just call because it's important for you to tell someone what happened. Mm-hmm. But they can help to make the situation better for you. They can make arrangements so that you are no longer in danger.
Okay.
If you're an adult, whether you choose to go to the police or not is entirely up to you, and we as an organisation don't participate in that choice. We can help you emotionally with what your choice is. Mm-hmm. We are one of 2 organisations in London that can provide counselling support. Mm-hmm. We have a helpline. It's incredibly important if you are able to reach out for help, because it's one of the loneliest things in the world to live with the spectre of this incredibly toxic, shameful secret that you've had to keep all of your life.
Mm-hmm. What about parents? How can parents know whether their child or their son, who's an adult male, is being sexually abused, and what can they do to help them?
So clearly, if the abuse involves penetration, then there are physical signs that you can look for. There's bruising, there's bleeding, there's all of those things. And then there are the more clear sort of psychological posters. Often children stop eating, they withdraw from society, they find relationships with their friends much more challenging, they change the way that they dress, they change the way that they are often with you. I mean, even as a non-offending parent, because you are cast in the role of a protector and something is happening you don't know about, that child is experiencing your not helping because you don't know, as a betrayal.
As a betrayal. And do they distrust their parent as well then? Or?
Well, clearly if the parent is involved in some way, yes. If the parent is not involved and the family relationship is not strong enough for the child to feel comfortable to immediately say what's happening, then yes, the part of the childish psychological response is to blame the parent. This shouldn't be happening to me. Yeah. You should stop this. I can't tell you, but you should still see what's happening to me. You should be able to stop this. It's very important for the child to be able to project that blame outside, because otherwise it eats them up to own it all for themselves.
So how can the parent help the child? If the parent has seen signs on their son, their young son, and what can they do to help?
They they can have an honest conversation. The parents find it really difficult, even in the best of circumstances, to talk to young children about something sexual.
Especially, I think, in the Asian community also.
Yeah, I mean, sex is demonized in the Asian community. The concept that people enjoy sex, whether you're an adult or not, it's already hard enough to deal with. And so to embrace the possibility of having a frank conversation with your child, where your child may tell you something that horrifies you.
Yeah.
And may put you in a position where you have to do something that may bring shame to your family, to your society. It's very complicated, but if your primary responsibility is to your child, then you have to be brave enough to have that conversation. And having heard what your child tells you, to say, yes, I believe you, and this is what we're going to do about it. As difficult as it is. And often it's difficult.
So how often does this happen to the child? And the person doing it, what kind of tactics do they use in order to stop the child from telling anyone? And like, why does it happen again and again, if that's the case? Or does it happen just once?
It's an impossible thing to know. So there are many people for whom an incident of abuse only happens once. And generally that's when someone further away from the family is involved. So it may be a teacher, it may be someone involved in a sports club, it may be a scoutmaster, it may be someone who has limited access, and often when it happens only once, the child is able to remove themselves because they know that it's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
People who are sexually involved with children use a process called grooming.
Okay.
It very rarely happens that a child is sexually assaulted or sexually abused out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Okay.
normally a period of weeks or months leading up to it in which slowly things are introduced into the conversation to make sort of jokes or conversations about sex more normal, to make touching something that becomes more easy. Also, part of that process is it's normalizing it so that as it increases, the child doesn't suddenly feel like something is happening. But also it's to involve the child so that when it gets to a point where something damaging is happening, they feel like they allowed it to happen. Mm-hmm. They feel responsible. They feel that, well, this is only happening because I've allowed these things already to take place, and so I'm responsible for it. I may have asked for it in some way. It's my duty or responsibility because this person is saying to me, oh, you know, I don't get this from anybody else. I love you so much. If you love me, then this is what you would do for me.
So the child blames themselves almost.
Yes.
And then why do these people do it to the child in the first place? What mental, psychological, are there any issues with the person who's doing it? Have they themselves been abused as children? What is the situation?
Again, that's one of the big myths, is that if you were abused as a child, you're likely to go on to abuse children. And evidentially, there's very little, if any, evidence to support that. We know, for example, there was in 1976, they did a survey of child offenders who were either in prison or about to go to prison to ask them about their experiences in childhood. And they all said that they had been abused as children. 2 years ago, they re-interviewed as many of the same people as they could find. Many had died or had left the country, who were no longer either in prison or at risk of going to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And 70% of them admitted that they'd lied because they said that they thought that by saying that they were abused as children, they would get a lighter sentence.
Right. Did they get a lighter sentence?
No.
No. Okay.
No, but it's part of that excuse-making thing.
So what makes a person want to abuse a child?
It's an unknown. There really is ongoing work is being done to try and understand it. It's about a power dynamic.
Control.
It's about being able to own an experience that you know that you shouldn't have in a way that makes you ultimately powerful.
Are there any techniques that children use in order to escape the realization of what they're going through at the time?
Yeah. So, the technical term is dissociation, but really it's as simple as finding a way to distance yourself from what's going on. And sometimes you go into a state where literally you kind of feel like you've left your body and you're looking in on yourself and going, oh, so that's happening to this person who is me, but I'm not thinking that it's me.
So they separate themselves from the body that they're actually in.
That's an extreme case, but often it's as much as being able to isolate things. I mean, creating a very adult ability to experience something in the moment that it's happening and the moment that it stopped happening, to not just pretend, but literally to cut it out of your mind.
So do these children literally forget that the thing happened?
Often, yes. Often forgetting is an important survival tool.
Mm-hmm.
But more than forgetting, because most of them do remember, what they manage to do is to create an emotional barrier that means that they have no feelings about it.
Okay.
They don't have anger, they don't have betrayal, they don't have resentment. They literally have, oh, that thing happened to me, and this is the rest of my life.
And what about as they mature and become adults? Do they start to forget that these things happened? Do they put them in a place in their mind where they cannot remember it? Do they have flashbacks? Does the abuse stop? Does it carry on?
Whether the abuse stops or carries on all depends on the situation. Often children, as they get older, are physically able, because they're bigger, literally to say to someone, no, I'm not doing that anymore, and to have less fear of the repercussions, because as you mature, you begin to understand actually the thing that they've been telling me all these years about the shame it will bring to my family and the debt that I owe them, actually it's not true, and so I can stop this happening.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it's as children get older that the combination, the cumulative effect of all these experiences that they've had, even if it's only for a very short time, really kicks in. And so that's when they feel most different from all of their contemporaries and colleagues, and that creates dangers and barriers for them. It's when they're most likely to start potentially using drugs or alcohol in a really unhealthy way, because they're looking for ways to make themselves feel better and to get away from the sense of difference that they have from everybody else.
I have known cases where some of my friends, as they are adults, they had no idea that they had been sexually abused, but all of a sudden something triggers off one day and they have flashbacks, and then they remember that a family member had been doing this to them,
Mm-hmm.
which they had mentally in their mind blocked off and forgotten about. Now, can you tell us a bit more about that?
But they haven't forgotten it, have they? Because if you forget something, you really don't have the ability to remember it. What they'd done is they'd sectioned it. They put it into an area of their mind where it didn't have to interact with the day-to-day running of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Trigger events happen all the time. For men, there are a couple ones that we come across a lot. So having a child of your own is a huge thing. It brings back, even for men that had no memories, and for those that had memories but thought it didn't matter, brings back a huge amount. Entering into a very serious relationship is another one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that people really have the capacity to forget abuse. I think that what happens is they find a way to protect themselves, and not remembering is not the same as forgetting.
Are there cases of children who were abused by a family member or someone close to them, as they got older and got through puberty, that they carried on being with this individual because now they have sexual feelings or emotional feelings to this person? Does that happen as well? Does the attachment happen that as the child becomes an adult, they end up being with the abuser, whether the abuser was a child themselves or an adult?
So yes, there's the answer to your question. It's uncommon because men and women who prey on children tend to have a cut-off age at which those children stop being sexually attracted to them because they're too old.
Okay.
You know, if you were attracted in a child and that child was 5 at the time and now they're 15, they're no longer the same sexual sort of attractant that you had before.
Okay.
It's uncommon but not unheard of for people. I can only talk about boys who are becoming men, to stay in a longer term abusive situation. It's not because they choose it, it's because they don't know how not to choose it. So
Right.
the thing that you abhor and despise the most in the world, if it's the only thing that you know, if this is the source of your comfort, then you go back to it, however damaging it may be.
Because you're so used to it.
Yeah.
What about children abusing children sexually?
Mm-hmm.
Are there cases about that? And
Yeah, there are. I mean, we see it in the newspaper all the time. There was in the Metro today, there was an article about a 12-year-old boy who had twice forced a 6-year-old girl to perform a sexual act on him, and the magistrate felt unfortunately unable to incarcerate him or put him into anything other than a situation where he's going to have to interact with the Young Offenders Service. It's increasingly common, and I don't know if it's increasingly common. We're hearing about it more.
Okay. Yeah.
We're fortunately moving ahead enough as a society that many things that we weren't hearing about more are becoming more evident now. It doesn't mean that they're happening now. It means that people are talking about them.
So this boy was going through puberty, but what about cases of prepubescent children who haven't gone through puberty doing sexual acts on each other as children? Because I've worked as a teacher in Germany before, and I have come across these cases, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Yes, it does happen, and those children may not have been abused in the context that we understand abuse, but if you're a prepubescent child and you're sexually interacting in something more than a doctor's and nurse's kind of way with other children, you've been
abused,
inappropriately sexualized in some way.
Okay, so that child themselves might have gone through some sexual violation, and therefore they're playing out the same game.
It's impossible to know what happened to them. I mean, it may well be that someone left the child filter off and they had access to pornography on the internet. It could be something much more sinister than that, but it does happen.
Okay, moving on to adult men who are sexually abused. Who abuses these men, and can you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, so we're talking about adult sexual assault. It's still vastly underreported, but we know that it happens a lot.
Okay.
And we know that it's only a relatively small number that actually end up in a penetrative assault.
Okay.
But all sorts of other things.
Is that anal or oral?
It can be both.
Okay.
We know that people assume that because it happens between men, that it's in some way a homosexual crime.
Do women sexually abuse adult men?
Yes, women certainly sexually assault men, and the law doesn't recognise it as rape.
It doesn't?
No. So the law of the United Kingdom requires you, as the perpetrator of a rape, to possess a working penis. You can't use a prosthetic, you can't use anything else. The offence becomes assault by penetration.
Can a female, by law, be charged for sexual abuse against a man?
Not rape.
Not rape. What could she be charged with?
She could be charged with assault by penetration if she used an object in order to penetrate him.
Okay.
If you were a man and you went out to a party and you got drunk and you fell asleep and you woke up and you found some woman, mounted on top of you, you could charge her with a sexual assault. But
so
in order for a rape to happen, you have to penetrate her against her consent.
So why is that case in the legislation? Is it because most adult male sexual violation cases are done by men themselves and not women?
Yeah, it's because the history of sexual abuse, of sexual violence legislation assumes that the perpetrator will be male.
And is that the case?
It's increasingly becoming clear that it's not entirely the case.
Okay.
The law in this case is looking at a majority that's dwindling.
What support services, again, to finalise for viewers out there who are going through this or their child has gone through this, for parents and for victims, what support services are there for people who have been sexually violated? In
the UK?
Yes.
So if you are a child or you are concerned about a child, then the NSPCC is always going to be the first place that you should go. It's a gold standard service, and they will do everything they can to help you. If you're a man, then we are one of 5 men only. There are about 25 across the country organisations that you can find by going on the internet that can provide you with emotional support through a helpline, or they can provide you with counselling. It's difficult because there are big geographic holes where your nearest service may be more than 30 miles away from you. Unfortunately, we're working towards making a change in that. If you're a woman, then Rape Crisis England and Wales is a much more populated organisation. It has outposts in about 100 different places across the country.
Okay. And then to finalise, did you want to tell the viewers about your own story, why you're working for Survivors UK, in order for them to relate to maybe their situation they're going? And if not, is there any other advice or pointers you want to give out to the viewers out there?
Well, I think it's really important to realise that I work for an organisation that's 1/10 of the size that it could or it should be. We're looking very specifically at a group of people who feel like the least important in terms of what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
No public attention is paid to them. No one wants to have conversations about what happened to them. They're rejected. The moment you, as a man, say, this happened to me, generally the response you get is, gosh, poor you, please don't tell me about it. It's too difficult.
It undermines their manhood or manliness. Or,
that they feel that they're compromised as a man on all sorts of levels because this happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredibly important for them to realise that it's a normal feeling, but it's not a helpful feeling, and by seeking help they can change it. They can have better and fuller lives.
So they can have a good future, a hopeful future.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And there are ways of getting over it and getting over your mental...
Getting over it is a really difficult sort of
Okay.
expression, isn't it? Because it means that you're beyond something. The model that we work with isn't about getting over anything. The model we work with is about understanding what happened to you, the effect it had on you, and that actually it's one of the many things in your life that makes you the person that you are. It's about understanding and accepting the person that you are is fine.
Is this the sort of counselling sessions that you have here, one-on-one or in a group?
Yes, so our one-on-one work is all about helping someone to integrate what happened to them, because you can't undo it. You can't undo any event that happened in your life. You fall down in the street and you cut your knee. You fell down in the street and you cut your knee. You can't undo that.
Okay, so you have to accept it and then move forward. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Michael May from Survivors UK.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on the Sikh channel. Thank you very much. This is Manjinder Singh from Survivors UK. Thank you.
Useful?